The NFL just increased the salary cap. Now that the salary cap has increased from $224.8 million to $255.4 million, the Chargers are in a much better cap situation than we have initially thought, and there is a very possible scenario where our favorite players like Khalil Mack and Mike Williams and Joey Bosa can all stay on this team. So make sure to like and subscribe if you do enjoy this content, man. It helps me out so much. And let me explain why this is so huge. Now, the salary cap was expected to increase because it does every year, but we did not expect it to increase as much as it did. The reports were that the new cap for this next season was going to be around the $240 million mark, but instead it is 255.4. So that gives the Chargers and every other team around the league 15 million more cap space to work with than we anticipated. So the Chargers were expected to be about 35 million over the cap just a couple weeks ago. Now they're only 25 million over the cap, not only thanks to the large salary cap from the NFL, but also because of the restructured deal by Corey Linsley, because now his cap hit is only 3.8 million instead of closer to 10 million. Corey Linsley has retired. If you didn't know, he hasn't made it official yet, but here's what Joe Hortiz had to say about him and the center position going forward.
We've talked, and I appreciate Corey for helping us out given his current situation. Well, Corey played 3 games last year. We had some guys that filled in for us there. Some are free agents, so obviously we're going to address that. Available guys in free agency, and then certainly the draft. We got guys on the roster that we feel can snap the ball right now, and we're excited about those guys. And then we'll continue to add pieces as we can.
So right now the Chargers are 25 million over the cap, but they can still get out of this pretty easily. And even when the cap was expected to be 15 million under what it is now, there were some pretty clever ways to go about this whole cap situation. And now that they have 15 million more cap space to work with, it just makes it even easier, man. And there is a very possible scenario here where they can actually keep all 4 of Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, Mike Williams, and Keenan Allen. I mean, it would strap them for cash, but they could certainly do it. In my opinion, I would rather have the cap space from trading Khalil Mack and Mike Williams. I think those are the 2 guys that would likely go. If we can keep Khalil Mack, now that especially we have this 15 million in cap space, I'd be all for it. But I think Mike Williams should be the guy to go. Now, it all depends on how active the Chargers want to be in free agency and how much flexibility they want to have with the cap moving forward with this season, because you got to keep in mind, in-season trades happen, in-season free agents happen. You want to have the cap space to be flexible and pick up some of those guys. So here's the scenario if you want to have all 4 of these big name players on the team still. First, what you would do is you would restructure Joey Bosa. That saves 10 million on the cap. Then you would cut Eric Kendricks, and that saves 7 million. I think that's an easy move to make because we can get that same production from someone in the draft like Junior Colson, who I really like from Michigan. Obviously, there's that connection there. And then Edgar and Cooper from Texas A&M, who I love as well. He's my favorite linebacker in the draft. But keep in mind that in this scenario of keeping all 4 of our big name guys, we're not going to have the money to be active in free agency or in the season. So you're going to have to be cutting an average starter here at linebacker and Eric Kendricks, hoping to fill that need in the draft, undrafted free agency, or in the later stages of free agency where it doesn't affect the comp pick formula, because we all know that every move that Joe Hortiz is going to make all revolves around that comp pick system and how he can manage a few extra late round picks while maintaining as many great players on the roster as possible. It's about establishing that farm system of comp picks. I mean, just listen to him talk about it.
All right, I'm a big fan of comp picks, all right? Number one, let's create that chain. Let's create that cycle of comp picks. How do you do that? You gain as many picks as you can early, and then you draft, and then make smart decisions on who you re-sign. Obviously, you want to extend your core players, but then there's some players we're not going to be able to because of the cap. But you want to create that cycle of comp picks, and you've got to manage your signings in free agency to do that. Certainly player workouts, let's turn that bottom of the roster. All right, let's turn that practice squad.
So now that we've made those 2 moves, we're still 8 million over the cap. So We can cut Morgan Fox. That's going to save an extra $3 million. And then we can extend both Khalil Mack for 1 more year. So instead of having him become a free agent after this season, we're going to have him for 2 more full seasons. And then we can extend Keenan Allen for either 1 or 2 more years. I would give him 2 more years because I think he's going to be a great wide receiver for at least that long. And now we have Keenan locked up for 3 more full seasons, Khalil Mack for 2 more full seasons, and then you restructure Justin Herbert to get all the way to $17 million in cap space, which is just barely enough to keep everyone and not be active in free agency basically like at all, and also sign all of our draft picks. But then this is where it gets really, really interesting, because if the Chargers trade down from the 5th overall pick, then they're not going to be paying their first round pick as much money. So they would have not only additional draft picks, but additional cap space and roster flexibility by trading down in the first round of the draft and still picking someone on their board who they love. Because I've been saying for a while now that they probably want an offensive lineman. And if they manage to keep Mike Williams, I mean, in this scenario, they did. Would you draft a wide receiver in the first round that early? Especially considering how great wide receivers recently have been on day 2 in the draft, and the depth of the wide receiver class in this year and basically every year in the past like 5 years. We're in a time right now where a good wide receiver can be had later on in the draft, and you don't need to draft that position as highly as a different position that doesn't have as much depth. Now, in this scenario, Mike Williams is still on the team, but I think and I would expect for them to either trade or cut Mike Williams, because I would rather have that $20 million in cap space than have him at wide receiver, not only because of the depth of the wide receiver class in this year, but also because I think the difference between a wide receiver that you draft in the 1st or 2nd, even 3rd round of the draft this year, the difference between them and Mike Williams, it's not worth the $20 million in cap space. So I think what you do, the plan doesn't really change with how the salary cap was increased with Mike Williams. You still get him off the books for this next season, and you draft a wide receiver at some point. Maybe it's in the 1st round. Hopefully it's on day 2, because I think that's where the money spot really is for wide receiver. I mean, just listen to what Joe Hortiz said this week at the scouting combine about the offensive line and wide receiver depth this year.
It seems like there's players at every round, certainly in the offensive line. There's some other deep positions in the draft. It seems to be a lot, most years the same positions, but wide receiver every year's, starting to put out more and more wide receivers because the way college football has changed. So, but yeah, it's a good depth draft for line.
I think for the Chargers, though, they're in a pretty good position because there's a lot of great depth at tackle, interior offensive line, and specifically center there, which is obviously where we need one, and wide receiver in the draft. They need all of those positions, and there's really good depth at every single one of those. So they could easily trade down and just pick, like, say, Terrion Arnold, because the cornerback class, maybe it's not as deep as those other positions, and Joe Hortiz likes the depth at those other 2 areas in tackle or offensive line, really, and wide receiver. So we might see it as drafting starters at cornerback in round 1, and then offensive line and wide receiver in rounds 2 and 3, because you can't draft a good starter at cornerback in day 2 the same way that you can draft a good wide receiver and offensive lineman on day 2 that can start for you. And let's just say in this scenario that they do that and they do trade down with Minnesota because they want JJ McCarthy, and now we have the 11th pick in the draft, and instead of paying that first round pick $6.8 million, they would only have to pay $4.1 million, which would save an extra $2.7 million and net them more draft picks on day 2 and in next year's draft probably. And with those extra picks, each one would have a cap hit of around $1 million. So they would need 3 day 2 picks in this year's draft to spend more money rather than less money if they were to trade down from that spot. Now, I think with all of that being said, the plan probably still does not change with what they want to do with Mike Williams, Joey Bosa, and Khalil Mack. I think they certainly have more flexibility, specifically with those edge rushers. There's a definite real scenario where they keep both Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack. All you really have to do is restructure Joey Bosa, and then you get rid of Mike Williams. They are probably listening to trade offers on every single one of those guys. And if someone offers, like, say, a second or a third round pick for Joey Bosa or Khalil Mack, then I'm not only going to give them Joey Bosa, but I am throwing in a lifetime supply of all you can eat buffet at the Chargers' new facility. And Khalil Mack for a day 2 pick, I mean, that would be awesome. And that's much more realistic, I think, than Joey Bosa for like a third round pick. But listen, man, teams make bad trades sometimes and they overpay for premium positions. Edge rusher is a premium position, and don't forget that the cap has increased by 15 million for every other team in the NFL as well. So trading for one of those 3 players, Mike Williams, Khalil Mack, and Joey Bosa, that cap hit, it's going to be a lot less painful for other teams to take on. So I don't think the plan really changes for the Chargers with this salary cap increase, but it certainly helps them out in the flexibility that they have in their overall roster management. If they cut or trade just Mike Williams and they keep both edge rushers, then you're talking about 37 million in cap space. And then if you get rid of Khalil Mack as well, then you're talking about 50 million in cap space for this season. And then if the Chargers want, they could get rid of Khalil Mack and Mike Williams and be some major players with 50 million in cap space in free agency this year. Then you're talking about signing like someone crazy, like Chris Jones, or even getting your center of the future. You could get a guy like Aaron Brewer or Andre James. I still wouldn't sign a big money running back like Saquon Barkley or Derrick Henry, but certainly a guy like Zach Moss or a DeAndre Swift would be a lot easier to take on. So that is the impact of the salary cap on the Chargers. Lots of added flexibility, but if you want to see my video from yesterday, the Chargers got their report cards in and they failed.